Daddy, don't worry. You will soon walk again, I promise.
Daddy, you will soon walk again, I promise. Kang Seojun heard the small voice before he opened his eyes, and for one disoriented moment, still half asleep in the gray morning light of a house that had felt too large and too quiet for 8 months, he almost believed the word daddy had been meant for him. It hadn't. Not yet. But something about the certainty in that child's voice would end up meaning more to him than almost anything else said in that house in the year that followed. And it would take most of that year for him to understand exactly why. To understand how he got to that morning, you have to go back to the night of the accident and further still, to the woman who had promised to stay and then very quietly, very efficiently, did not. Her name was Isabella Grant, and for 3 years before the crash that put Seojun in a wheelchair, she had been, by every outward measure, the perfect partner for a man building an empire. Elegant at galas, sharp in negotiations, endlessly patient with his 80-hour weeks. When the accident happened, a highway collision that left his spine damaged badly enough that doctors spoke carefully about uncertain outcomes, Isabella had sat beside his hospital bed for the first several days, holding his hand, telling him none of it changed anything between them. It changed everything, as it turned out, though not in any way he saw coming. 3 months into his recovery, while Seojun was still relearning how to transfer himself from bed to wheelchair without help, Isabella began spending increasing amounts of time with David Kessler, the man who had been Seojun's business partner for nearly a decade. The two of them meeting, she explained, purely to keep the company steady while Seojun focused on healing. 6 months in, she stopped visiting as often. By the 8th month, she had moved out entirely, and 3 weeks after that, Seojun learned from a business associate, rather than from her directly, that Isabella Grant had married David Kessler in a small private ceremony neither of them had thought to invite him to. He told himself, in the numb weeks that followed, that it was simple cowardice. A woman who had discovered she wasn't built for a harder version of the life she'd signed up for, choosing an easier one instead. It would take him considerably longer to understand that cowardice had never been the reason at all. By the time Camille Ward and her daughter Ivy entered his household, hired through an agency to manage the house he could no longer maintain properly himself, Seojun had settled into something that resembled survival more than living. He worked from his study most days, avoided mirrors that showed him the wheelchair too directly, and had grown accustomed to a particular flavor of quiet that filled a house built for a family that had, in the end, never quite arrived. Ivy was 7 years old, quick and unbothered in a way most adults around Seojun had stopped being since the accident, and she treated the wheelchair the way children often do, as an interesting fact about a person rather than a tragedy requiring careful navigation. "Why do you always look out that window like you're waiting for someone?" she asked him one afternoon, several weeks after her mother had started working there, finding him in the study staring at the long driveway the way he often did without quite admitting to himself why. "I'm not waiting for anyone," he told her, which was mostly a lie. Ivy considered this with the particular skepticism only a child seems able to summon. "My mama says people who stare at driveways are always waiting for someone," she said, "even if they say they're not." He didn't answer that, and Ivy, apparently satisfied she'd made her point, wandered off to find her mother, leaving him alone with the uncomfortable accuracy of what she'd said. Seojun's lawyer called on a Tuesday afternoon with a request that seemed, at first, almost administrative. A routine signature needed on a shareholder document. Nothing unusual for a man who still technically ran a company from his study, even if he hadn't set foot in its headquarters in nearly a year. But something about the document's phrasing bothered Seojun enough that he read it 3 times before signing anything, and on the 3rd read, he found the sentence that would keep him awake for most of that night. The document quietly restructured voting rights on a specific class of shares. Shares that, as it happened, David Kessler had been steadily acquiring for months through 3 different holding entities Seojun had never heard of. "Why is David buying up this class specifically?" Seojun asked his lawyer the next morning, And why does this document make it sound like a formality when it's actually a fairly significant shift in control? His lawyer, a careful man who chose his words with visible caution, admitted he wasn't certain, but agreed to look into it further. It would take him considerably longer than either of them expected to get a straight answer, and every week that passed without one deepened the particular, cold unease sitting in Seo-jun's chest. The growing suspicion that Isabella's departure and David's marriage to her had never really been about love at all, and that whatever had actually motivated it was still, somehow, unfolding. He did not tell Camille or Ivy about any of it, not at first. It felt, in those early weeks, like a separate compartment of his life entirely. The business threat sealed away in his study, the strange, quiet warmth of the household's newest routines kept carefully apart from it. Those routines had crept up on him gradually. Ivy took to finding him in the garden most afternoons after school, describing her day in the scattered, confident way children do. And somewhere in the accumulation of those afternoons, Seo-jun had started looking forward to them with an intensity that surprised him. Camille, for her part, managed the house with a steadiness that asked nothing of him beyond what the job required, and yet somehow made the whole place feel less like a monument to what he'd lost, and more like somewhere a person could actually live. You should let Ivy try the leg thing, Camille told him one evening, several weeks in, catching him in the kitchen after Ivy had gone to bed. The leg thing, he repeated. She's been asking, Camille said. She thinks she can help you walk again. My mother used to do something similar, working with people who'd lost feeling in different parts of their bodies. Ivy watched her enough times as a toddler that some of it apparently stuck. Seo-jun, who had endured a year of expensive specialists offering increasingly modest promises, found himself, against every reasonable instinct, saying yes. The sessions began the following week, in the quiet part of the garden where the house's tall windows couldn't quite see them. Ivy worked with the same unshakable confidence she brought to everything, pressing her small hands along his calves, insisting the leg wasn't dead, only weak, promising him, "Daddy, you will soon walk again, I promise," the exact sentence he would hear again months later, though its meaning would have grown considerably larger by then, is what she said, unprompted, on the very first afternoon, apparently having decided somewhere along the way that this was simply what she called him now. Without asking permission or waiting for him to correct her. He didn't correct her. He found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he didn't want to. Considerably 3 weeks later, when Seo-jun's lawyer finally called back with something concrete. The holding entities acquiring your shares, he said, all trace back to the same source, David Kessler. But there's something else. One of the entities was created only 4 months ago, and its formation documents list a secondary beneficiary. Who? Seo-jun asked, though some cold, quiet part of him had already begun to suspect the answer. Isabella Grant, his lawyer said. Now Isabella Kessler, technically. She's not just married to the man acquiring your company's controlling interest. She's a direct beneficiary of the acquisition itself. Seo-jun sat with that for a long moment, the pieces of the last year rearranging themselves into a shape considerably uglier than heartbreak. She didn't leave because she couldn't handle the wheelchair, he said slowly. No, his lawyer agreed. It looks considerably more calculated than that. The investigation that followed unfolded slowly, the way these things do when the people orchestrating them have had a year's head start to cover their tracks. Seo-jun brought in an investigator named Frank Delgado, a patient, unhurried man who had spent his career untangling exactly this kind of corporate knot. And together, they began assembling a picture that made Seo-jun's chest go tight every time a new piece of it arrived. David hadn't simply married Isabella after the accident. Delgado's research showed the two of them had known each other for considerably longer than either had ever let on, years, in fact, predating even Seo-jun's engagement to Isabella. The accident, when it happened, hadn't created their relationship. It had simply created an opportunity, one they appeared to have recognized and moved on with a patience that unsettled Seo-jun more than outright aggression would have. They didn't need you to die, Delgado told him plainly, laying out timelines and financial records across the study desk one evening. They needed you distracted, isolated, and slow to notice what was happening to your company while you focused on staying alive and learning to function again. Every month you spent in physical therapy instead of a boardroom was a month they used to quietly consolidate control. Seo-jun looked at the documents for a long time before speaking. How much do they already have? Enough that if the final acquisition goes through, Delgado said, they won't just have influence. They'll have outright control, and there won't be a legal path back from that once it's done. How long until that happens? Seo-jun asked. Delgado checked his notes. Based on the filing timeline, he said, 6 weeks, maybe less. 2 weeks into the investigation, David Kessler made his own move, not against Seo-jun directly, but against the one part of his life David had apparently decided was vulnerable enough to exploit. Camille received a call at the house one afternoon from a woman claiming to represent a competing household staffing agency, offering her a position at nearly double her current salary. No interview required. Start date flexible. I found it strange enough to mention it to you, she told Seo-jun that evening, though I almost didn't. It felt rude to bring up, like I was fishing for a raise. Seo-jun felt something cold move through him. Did they say which agency? He asked. Camille gave him the name. Delgado confirmed within the hour that no such agency existed under that name in any public registry, and that the phone number Camille had been called from traced back to a prepaid line purchased 2 days earlier, paid for in cash. They're trying to remove you from the house before this goes any further, Delgado told Seo-jun grimly. Whether that's to isolate you again the way the accident did, or because they've realized how much you've come to depend on the stability she and her daughter provide, I can't say for certain. But it's not a coincidence, and it means they're watching more closely than we assumed. Seo-jun called Camille into the study that same evening and told her, for the first time, the full scope of what had been unfolding in the weeks since Isabella's name first surfaced in the shareholder documents. The holding companies, the timeline, the acquisition deadline closing in, and now, apparently, an attempt to remove her and Ivy from the house entirely. I should have told you sooner, he admitted. I was trying to protect you from it. I understand now that not telling you didn't protect anyone. It just left you unprepared for something that was already circling closer than I wanted to admit. Camille absorbed all of it with the same steady composure she brought to everything, though he watched her jaw tighten slightly at the mention of the fake staffing call. They tried to buy me off, she said slowly, working through the implication out loud. Which means they think I matter to whatever you're building against them. You do matter, he said, more than you probably realize. Then let's make sure they regret underestimating that, Camille said, and something in her voice, calm and entirely unafraid, told him she meant every word of it. He did not tell Camille and Ivy the full scope of it, not yet, though Camille noticed the shift in him almost immediately. The late nights in the study, the tension that had crept back into his shoulders after months of slowly, gradually easing. You don't have to carry whatever this is alone, she told him one evening, finding him at the kitchen table long after Ivy had gone to bed, a glass of untouched tea cooling in front of him. I don't want to put you and Ivy at risk, he said, whatever this becomes. Camille studied him for a long moment. We've been at risk before, she said. Different kind, maybe, but risk all the same. I don't think you get to decide alone what we can and can't handle. He looked at her, struck, not for the first time, by the particular steadiness she brought into every room she occupied. Nothing performed about it, nothing seeking credit, just a plain, unshakable willingness to stand where she was needed. They're trying to take everything I built, he admitted finally, while I was too broken to notice. Then we make sure they don't finish, Camille said, with a simplicity that made the whole enormous problem feel, for the first time in weeks, like something that might actually be survivable. The recovery continued alongside the investigation, the two threads of his life running in uneasy parallel, afternoons in the garden, with Ivy pressing her hands against legs that responded, week by week, with slightly more than they had the week before, and evenings in the study with Delgado and his lawyer. building the case that would either save his company or arrive 6 weeks too late to matter. I felt something, he told Ivy one afternoon, several weeks into their sessions. A flicker of real sensation running down his left leg for the first time since the accident. Ivy nodded, entirely unsurprised, the way she was unsurprised by most things she'd already decided would happen eventually. I told you, she said. It just had to remember you weren't giving up on it. By the 5th week, he managed to stand, briefly, gripping the garden bench with both hands, his legs trembling but holding. By the 6th week, the same week Delgado's deadline arrived, he took his first unassisted steps in over a year, 3 of them slow and unsteady, Ivy walking backward in front of him the entire way, coaching him forward with the same unshakable confidence she brought to everything. I'm walking, he said, breathless, disbelieving. Yes, Ivy said, beaming up at him. You are. Now we just have to make sure nobody takes it away from you. The confrontation happened 5 days before the acquisition deadline, at an emergency board meeting Seo Jun requested through his lawyer, framed publicly as a routine check-in on his recovery, and privately as the moment he intended to stop pretending he hadn't noticed what was happening to his own company. Isabella arrived with David, both of them composed and polished in the way people are when they believe they've already won. And Seo Jun watched something flicker across Isabella's face when he walked into the boardroom on his own 2 legs. No wheelchair, no cane, steadier than she had clearly expected him to ever be again. You're walking, she said before she could stop herself. I am, he said. Did that complicate something for you? The board members present exchanged uneasy glances, sensing, correctly, that this was not going to be the routine check in the meeting notice had promised. Seo Jun didn't waste time on preamble. He laid out what Delgado had found, the holding entities, the timeline predating his accident, the acquisitions scheduled to complete within days, the beneficiary structure that connected every piece of it directly back to the 2 people sitting across the table from him. You didn't fall in love with David after my accident, he said, looking at Isabella directly. You'd already built a plan with him long before that highway collision ever happened. My accident wasn't the reason you left. It was the opportunity you'd been waiting for. Isabella's composure cracked, briefly, before she caught it and rebuilt it into something colder. You have no proof of any coordinated plan, she said. David and I developing feelings for each other during a difficult period isn't a crime. No, David Kessler said, speaking for the first time, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who believed he still held every advantage in the room. It isn't. And neither is a legitimate business acquisition, executed entirely within the bounds of shareholder agreements you signed yourself, years ago, before any of this began. Seo Jun looked at him for a long moment. Then let's discuss the timeline discrepancy, he said, and nodded to his lawyer, who placed a single document on the table. A formation record for the earliest of the 3 holding entities, dated 11 months before Seo Jun's accident. The room went very quiet. You were already building this before I ever crashed my car, Seo Jun said, which means the accident wasn't your opportunity at all. It was simply the moment you decided to accelerate a plan you'd already been running for the better part of a year. That's not an unfortunate coincidence, David. That's premeditation, and I don't think a board full of shareholders is going to feel particularly comfortable handing control of this company to 2 people who spent a year quietly engineering the incapacitation of its founder. I wasn't incapacitated, he added after a pause. I was recovering. There's a difference, and apparently it's one you badly underestimated. Isabella looked at him for a long moment, something calculating moving behind her composed expression, before she tried one final approach. Even if everything you're suggesting were true, she said, careful and measured, what exactly do you think a board full of shareholders is going to do about a plan that technically broke no laws? Poor judgment isn't fraud, Seo Jun. Bad timing isn't a crime. Timeline manipulation of shareholder disclosures is a crime, his lawyer said quietly, sliding a second document across the table. Which is what you'll find on page 4 of that formation record, a materially misleading statement filed with the very acquisition paperwork you're relying on, claiming no prior relationship existed between the two beneficiary parties before the date of the founder's incapacitation. That's not bad timing. That's a filed, provable lie. The room went very still. David's confidence, which had carried him through the entire meeting so far, finally cracked into something closer to alarm. That filing was standard language, he said. Boilerplate. My counsel drafted it. Then your counsel drafted a false statement on a federal disclosure form, Seo-jun's lawyer said, and I'd strongly advise you retain separate representation before this conversation continues any further. Because right now, the interests of everyone at this table are no longer aligned. The board vote that followed, called on an emergency basis once the formation date became public record, stripped David Kessler of his position entirely and froze the pending acquisition pending a full securities investigation. Isabella, whose name appeared as a direct beneficiary on documents predating her supposed heartbreak by nearly a year, found herself named in the same investigation days later. Her carefully built story of a woman who simply couldn't handle a harder life collapsing in the same public, unglamorous way David's business empire had. Seo-jun did not feel triumphant when it was over, exactly. He felt, more than anything, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent a year fighting two separate wars, one against his own body, one against people who had counted on that body failing him permanently, and had somehow, against considerable odds, won both. She's really gone, Ivy asked him that evening, once the news had settled and the house had gone quiet again. Really gone, he confirmed. Ivy nodded, satisfied, the way she was satisfied by most outcomes she'd already decided would happen eventually. Good, she said. Now you can just be happy instead of sad and busy at the same time. He looked at her for a long moment, struck again by how thoroughly this small, unshakable girl had rearranged the entire shape of his life without ever once asking permission to do so. He didn't rush what came after. Camille had spent years being careful about which men decided her steadiness was something they were entitled to, and he had no intention of asking her to lower that guard faster than she was ready to. So he simply kept showing up in small, unglamorous ways. He asked about her day and waited for the real answer instead of the polite one. He noticed when she was tired and quietly rearranged Ivy's schedule so Camille could rest without having to ask for it. He never once let his wealth become the language of what he felt, no grand gestures, no attempts to be noticed for his generosity, just consistency, day after day, until consistency itself became its own kind of proof. You never asked me anything about myself before all this started, Camille told him one evening, months later, the two of them sitting on the garden bench where Ivy's recovery sessions had once taken place. I know, he admitted. I was too far inside my own collapse to notice there was a whole person managing my house who deserved to be asked. I'm sorry it took me this long. She considered that for a while. You're asking now, she said. That counts for something. There was an evening, not long after, when he nearly undid the careful, unnamed thing growing between them with a single, well-meant mistake. He'd arranged, without asking, for a car to collect Camille and Ivy from the grocery store instead of the walk they usually took, imagining it as nothing more than a small kindness. Camille thanked the driver politely, and then asked him, quietly and directly, to cancel any future arrangements like it. I didn't ask for that, she said, not unkindly but firmly. I need you to ask before you decide what makes my life easier, even kind things. He sat with the correction for a long time afterward, understanding that he'd made the same mistake wealth always tempted a person into solving instead of asking, deciding instead of listening. I'm sorry, he told her. You're right. I won't do that again. It taught him something he carried forward into every day that followed, that loving her well meant asking rather than assuming. And he found, to his quiet surprise, that this slower way of caring for someone felt sturdier than anything his money had ever built on its own. What are you afraid of? He asked her one evening, months later, sitting together on the low garden wall while Ivy chased fireflies across the darkening lawn. That this is gratitude wearing the shape of something bigger, Camille admitted. That once your company's rebuilt, the danger fully behind you, I'll start to look like part of the crisis, instead of part of the life you actually want. I've had a year to watch exactly what kind of person shows up when there's nothing to gain from showing up, he told her. You never once asked me for anything, Camille. Not when I couldn't walk and not now that I can. I know exactly what I'm choosing, and it has nothing to do with gratitude. She reached over and took his hand, and this time she let herself hold on. It was on one of those quiet evenings, weeks later, that Camille told him the rest of her own story. Not the part that belonged to the crisis, but the part that belonged only to her. I trained as a paralegal, before Ivy, she told him, sitting across from him at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet. Got most of the way through my certification before Ivy's father left, and the money for tuition stopped making sense next to rent and childcare. Household work paid steadier, and it let me keep hours flexible enough to still be the one who picked her up from school every day. Seo Jun listened without interrupting, understanding by then that Camille told her history the way she did everything else. Slowly, deliberately, without asking for sympathy along the way. I don't regret it, she continued. I could never say that about anything that led to Ivy. But watching Delgado and your lawyer work these past weeks, tracing all those shell companies, building the case piece by piece, some part of me has been itching to finish what I started all those years ago. You still could, Seo Jun said. Camille considered that for a long moment. Maybe, she admitted, maybe now I actually could. It was, he would think later, the first time she had ever spoken about her own future as something that belonged to her alone, rather than something folded entirely into keeping Ivy safe and fed and believed. He said nothing more about it that night, understanding that the kindest thing he could do was let her arrive at her own next steps in her own time. It was Ivy, in the end, who asked the question neither adult had spoken aloud yet. Are you going to marry my mommy? She asked him plainly one afternoon, watching him walk the length of the garden path unassisted, steady now in a way that had become almost ordinary over the past several months. I hope to, he said, if she'll have me, and if that's something you want too. Ivy considered this with the gravity she brought to everything. I need to know something first, she said. He waited. If something bad ever happens again, will you tell us the truth? Or will you try to protect us by keeping it to yourself, the way you did with the company stuff at first? He knelt down to meet her height, the question landing harder than she probably realized. I'll never hide the truth from you or your mother again, he said. I spent a year learning what it costs to keep people at a distance to protect them. It doesn't protect anyone. It just leaves them unprepared. I don't want to make that mistake again. Ivy studied him for a long moment, then nodded, satisfied. The way she nodded at everything once she decided it was true. Okay, she said, then yes, you can marry my mommy. He proposed the following spring, in the same garden where Ivy had first pressed her small hands against his calf, and told him it wasn't dead, only weak, kneeling in front of Camille with steady legs and a steadier heart than he'd carried through any part of the year before. I met you during the worst stretch of my life, though I didn't understand at the time how much of my survival, the company, the recovery, all of it would end up depending on you and your daughter's steadiness, he told her. You never once asked what you could get from this house. You only ever gave, quietly, consistently, without needing to be noticed for it. I don't want a life built on performance or secrets ever again. I want the life where someone tells me the truth, even when it costs them nothing to stay quiet instead. Camille, will you marry me? She was crying before he finished the sentence. Yes, she said. Of course, yes. From a few feet away, Ivy let out a whoop of pure joy that sent a flock of birds scattering from the trees above them, and came running toward them both, arms outstretched, ready to be caught by the two people who had, without either of them fully planning it, built her a family out of the wreckage of a betrayal and a wheelchair, and a year neither of them had expected to survive intact. They married that autumn, in the same garden, with string lights instead of boardroom tension, and a guest list built entirely from the people who had actually mattered during the hardest year of his life. Delgado stood near the front, along with his lawyer, both of them looking considerably more relaxed than they had during any of their late-night meetings in his study. Ivy walked the aisle first, scattering flower petals with the same seriousness she had once used to promise a grieving man his legs would work again. I met you during the worst year of my life, Seo-jun told Camille in his vows, and somehow you and your daughter became the reason I ever walked out of it standing up, in every sense of that phrase. You never once asked what you could get from this house. You only ever gave, and I promised to spend the rest of my life being the kind of husband who deserves that. I spent years believing that quiet, steady work was the safest way to survive in other people's houses, Camille said in hers. You taught me that safety was never the thing worth protecting above everything else. Truth was, my daughter believed that before I fully did, and I am endlessly grateful she was brave enough to promise a broken man his legs back before she had any real reason to believe it herself, because it gave all three of us a family none of us knew we were still allowed to want. 5 years later, the garden that had once held a long, uncertain recovery and an even longer fight to protect everything he'd built held something else entirely. A wooden bench, a small toddler girl chasing butterflies across the grass, and Ivy, 12 now, reading in the shade with the same serious concentration she had once used to press her hands against a stranger's leg and insist it wasn't dead, only weak. You're doing the thing again, she said, without looking up, watching her stepfather stand at the edge of the garden with a small, distant smile, entirely steady on his own 2 legs. Guilty, Seo-jun admitted. Thinking about the promise, Ivy said, it's always the promise. He looked at her, and then at Camille, seated nearby with their youngest daughter asleep against her shoulder, and felt something settle in his chest that had never once, in all his years of boardrooms and betrayal and quiet fear, come close to what he felt standing there with his whole family gathered around him in the late afternoon light. Some promises are worth thinking about more than once, he said. This story carries one truth worth remembering. The people who save us rarely arrive already trusted, already believed, already given the benefit of the doubt the world extends so easily to polish and charm. They arrive small, uncertain, and honest, making promises no one has any reason yet to believe, and then spending months, quietly and without fanfare, keeping every single one of them. Real love, in the end, isn't the person who performs devotion loudest before disappearing the moment it costs them something. It's the person who shows up, again and again, long after showing up has stopped being easy, until a promise made in a garden becomes simply the truth of an entire life. If this story moved you, let us know where you're watching from. And stay close, because at Afrokorean Love Stories, this is only the beginning of the lives we still have to tell.